There are surely plenty of theories as to why traffic fatalities are up over the past few months in too many Ontario cities. Maybe with all the COVID lockdowns, people's driving skills are rusty. Maybe those lockdowns have made us less patient and more irritable on the roads. Maybe incorporating more bike lanes on major streets has made sharing the road more difficult. Regardless, the fact is there is still far too much carnage, and there are tragically too many people still dying on the streets of our cities and towns. One such incident recently drew a great deal of attention to the subject. One of Canada's greatest maestros, Boris Brott, became the victim of a fatal hit and run right near his home in Hamilton. So we start there tonight. From that city, Fallon Hewitt, reporter for the Hamilton Spectator. And Fallon, I wonder if we can just start, as I welcome you to the program, by having you tell us the details about what happened to Boris Brott on the 5th of April.
Yeah, so the 5th of April was like kind of like a sunny and warm spring day. It was really like an average day. I live in the lower city, so I had went for a walk that morning, and so that morning we were in the newsroom in Stoney Creek, and I think it was around 10 a.m. when police put out a tweet that there had been a collision involving pedestrian near Durand Park, and an older man had been left critically injured, and that the car had fled the scene. And then there were a series of other collisions that followed that were happening around the city. We were trying to figure out what happened, and it ended up that they all were connected in the end of the day. But later in the afternoon, police had announced that the older gentleman, who had not been identified but was obviously later identified as Boris, had died of his injuries. I think it was just later in the afternoon. The crash happened around 10, and I believe he died later in the afternoon, or we found out about that.
It's funny you describe him as an older man. He was 78 years old, but he was the youngest 78-year-old I ever knew. Anyway, let's continue. What can you tell us about the person who killed him?
So Arsen Ajlajovic, he is from Grimsby, and so he is in his 30s. And from far as we know, he had like a history of some driving charges. He had specifically in August or in the summer of 2019, there had been an incident in a Grimsby park where he had rented a van and drove it through a crowded park there near the lake. And he had actually had his license suspended and had been charged with dangerous driving.
How long was the license suspended for?
It was about 12 months. I believe the Crown had appealed for 18, but his defense wanted 12, and he managed to get the 12. Originally, if they had the 18-month suspension, he wouldn't have actually had a license the day that Boris was struck.
So it's not to say that he wouldn't have been in the car anyway, because we know people drive with suspended licenses, but yeah. I guess there's a chance he wouldn't have been. Where is he now?
To our knowledge, or as far as our reporting has gone, I believe he's still in custody and still perhaps in jail waiting for next appearances. That's as far as our reporting has gone.
Gotcha. Fallon, can you tell us, I mean, the example of Boris Brott was not the only one. I keep up and I read your newspaper fairly faithfully, and there have been many, many hit and runs or fatalities, pedestrian fatalities in Hamilton already this year. I think as many at this halfway through the year as there were all of last year. What's going on in your view?
Yeah, I don't know if it's like you had mentioned, like the pandemic, or like what exactly is happening. Like there's a lot of sort of theories that are bounced around by like road safety advocates. Like there's the question of the design of roads, such as Main Street East and King Street East, where there have been 2 fatal collisions, at least to my count, and then several other like collisions have seen people seriously injured. I don't know if it's the culture of driving, the impatience of drivers, the design of roadways. It's a little hard to pinpoint because there's been so many different variables in some of these crashes. Like there was one earlier in the year at King and Main Street, which is an intersection in the central east part of the city, where the person who was driving the car had stolen the vehicle, and it was early, it was in the wee hours of the morning. So it's really hard to, and then crashed and killed 3 pedestrians that were just on the sidewalk. And then on Main Street East, there was the collision with that killed the Darts bus driver. And it's unclear what exactly is, if there are linkages or if it's all situational, but there are a lot of different like theories and reasons that people believe that this is happening.
That's Fallon Hewitt, reporter for the Hamilton Spectator. Fallon, we thank you for getting us started tonight, and we're going to continue to discuss this in more detail now. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Well, let's welcome another voice to our conversation. In Parry Sound, Ontario, we're now joined by Eleanor McMahon. The former Ontario cabinet minister lost her husband, OPP officer Greg Stobart, when he was hit by a truck while cycling on a country road near Milton. The truck driver had 5 violations for driving with a suspended license and $14,000 in fines outstanding at the time of the incident. Eleanor, you and I, again, as I welcome you to the program, you and I have had this conversation far too many times, I'm sorry to say, but I know that, well, let me put it this way. My dad and I saw Boris Brott and his wife Ardith a week before he was killed. So, I mean, the shock you can imagine. But I suspect, given your background, you had a different or distinctive reaction to the news of his death than maybe anybody else in the province. When you heard the news, what went through your head?
Well, thanks, Steve. I knew Boris as well. I had the privilege of serving as Minister of Culture, and I sit on the board of the Art Gallery of Hamilton. So both of those things brought me into contact with Boris, the wonderfully talented and amazing Boris Brott. Condolences to his family. I was so shocked and saddened by the suddenness of it. Even though my husband's been gone for 15 years, these are triggering events for people like me whose heart sinks when you hear of another tragic loss that was entirely preventable. Fallon's dissertation on the accused and his record and so on is a very, very familiar story to me and to my family. And we were fortunate in that Greg's loss prompted significant change in cycling policy and laws and legislation in Ontario, which I had the privilege of doing when I started the Share the Road Cycling Coalition in his memory. So I was saddened, and it just tells me how much more work we have to do to enhance the livability of our communities. And there's a long list of things. Unfortunately, it's not a silver bullet. These are never one and done things, or geez, if we just change this, everything is magically going to come into line. It's simply not the case.
I'm sure you've asked yourself this question 1,000 times, but we're going to make it 1,001 here. And that is, how is it possible for the man who ended up taking the life of your husband to have been behind the wheel in the first place, given all the violations and fines outstanding that he had at that time?
Well, I listened to Fallon again mention the driving history and abstract of the fellow who's charged with killing Boris. And it's a very similar story. The guy that killed Greg was a commercial driver. He was driving for a living, which makes his actions that much more shocking because he was allowed to continue to drive. I think if I look at my long list that I mentioned a moment ago, in addition to work that we need to do on lowering speeds, because speed kills, and there's plenty of data that shows you that people die exponentially more, even with 5 kilometers more in terms of, speeds. But changing the court system in Ontario, Steve, which feels like a tall order, is incredibly important to changing the behavior of the accused, because the fellow that killed Greg, much like the fellow that's charged in this incident, had a long record of poor driving history. And I feel, and maybe this is something we could all discuss, I feel almost as though Ontarians and Canadians, we've become numb to the number of people that die on our roads every year. 1 person a day, almost, in Ontario was killed last year. There's an epidemic of speed that's making those fatalities more profound and more common. But we need to do work on our provincial offences court, because when that fellow gets charged, much like the guy that killed Greg, he goes to the provincial offences court. And in our case, the judge gave him even after knowing that record, which comes out at the end of trial normally, he got 100 hours of community service, Steve. Even though the Crown had said that this guy should go to jail, and I am not someone who wanted him punished because I was, bent on, seeing retribution. But I do think it sends the wrong kind of signal when we don't adjudicate these trials in ways that, send a very strong signal that pedestrian loss, cycling loss, the most vulnerable of our road users, is more egregious in some ways than, when we should treat it accordingly. So we have lots of work to do in the POA system to reform our courts. They're clogged with cases. The trials get set. The charges are laid by an officer at the side of the road. I think I'm proud of what we did at Share the Road. And when I was minister, I changed the Highway Traffic Act 3 times in Greg's memory. Still, it gets to court. The cases get pled down, and people end up walking away with potentially a missed opportunity to send them a very strong signal that it's not okay that you drive habitually without a license or continue to drive under suspension. Even though we've changed the laws, and Ontario, Steve, has some of the toughest laws in the country, we have a lot of work to do, I'm afraid, around our POA system, lowering speeds. And I'm sure we'll get to the conversation about how to build communities that are safer, because cities aren't for cars, Steve, they're for people. And what most of us know about cities in Europe is that they've taken this approach of a hierarchy of vulnerability. Pedestrians and cyclists are treated with the kind of care and attention they need because we want more people cycling and walking. It's better for them. It's better for the environment. We want that. And they lower speed limits. I was just in Montreal last week, Steve, for work. The inner city speed limit in Montreal on most of the roads that I was on is 30 kilometers an hour.
I want to ask you one more question before we invite a couple of other voices to join us for this conversation, and that is, as you pointed out, you spent 3 years after Greg's death trying to convince government to toughen road safety laws. What resulted was something named after your husband called Greg's Law. You created an organization designed to help share the road, the Share the Road Cycling Coalition. Eleanor, if I know you, though, I know you probably wanted to do a lot more. And you got to the cabinet table and you sat around that cabinet table. And I want to know what's going on either in cabinet or in government or in the public service or in society that prevented you from going even further than you ended up getting.
That's a really, really good question. I feel, Steve, in fairness, that we were able to achieve a great deal. There's clearly more work to do, however, as you've pointed out. I will say there's a good and bad list. The good list is that we have 70% of Ontarians living in recognized bicycle-friendly communities where municipalities have prioritized all of the things that are necessary to make communities safer, livable, easier for cyclists to access, and that enhances them for everyone. The bike that's in front of you is the car that isn't, which helps congestion and it helps the environment. So more to do for sure. I'm not sure that I was prevented necessarily, Steve, but I'm sympathize and empathize, having sat around that table and been in public life myself, that there are a number of priorities that a minister or a politician has to address. We've been seized with COVID and the impacts on the economy, and maybe we've taken our eye off the ball a little bit, Steve. And I think incidents like that, where Boris lost his life, remind us that we can't afford to take the eye off the ball when an Ontarian every day is dying because of traffic fatalities. And a good chunk of those are pedestrians who died in a senseless way, just like Boris did. So let's put our eye back on the ball where it belongs and begin to address that to-do list. I've mentioned a few things, Steve, that I think we could be focusing on with greater intensity, and I'd like to see us go even further. When we were in government, we did lower the speed limits and gave municipalities the power to lower speed limits in the inner city, and I think this just needs a greater share of voice than it's getting now.
Well, let's see what we can do about that over the next 20 minutes or so, because we want to add some academic expertise on our discussion now. Let's start in Waterloo, Ontario, with Jeff Cosello, Professor of Transportation Planning and Engineering at the University of Waterloo, and in the provincial capital on the University of Toronto campus, there's Shoshana Sachs, Assistant Professor in the Department of Civil and Mineral Engineering at U of T and the Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Infrastructure. And as I welcome you two to our discussion as well, Jeff, I want to start with you and ask you this. I know that there are people watching this or listening on podcast who are saying to themselves right now, you know what? Accidents happen, and the best engineering in the world is not going to stop it. You can make all the Highway Traffic Act amendments you want. You can reduce speed limits all you want. As awful as these tragedies are, we just have to accept that they're going to continue to happen. I want to know, in your view, whether that is the accurate and right thinking.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, for the question. And first, just let me offer condolences to the Brott family and, of course, to Eleanor, whom we've had these conversations with. I mean, sincerely, it is a tragedy, and I just want to extend my sympathies for their losses. This notion, Steve, that these are accidents, that these are not preventable, that's not correct at all. Certainly, there is always going to be human error. There's going to be some incidents where we are going to have unfortunate outcomes. But through design and through awareness and through education and through attention of our community, we should be moving in a direction where our rate is reducing every single year. And that hasn't been the case. And that's problematic. And I think that shows, I think some of the things you were trying to get at with your questions to Eleanor is about a lack of political will, a lack of energy, a lack of resources being dedicated to what is really an enormous urban and rural problem for Canada and the world.
All right, Shoshana, let me follow up with you on this. In the larger cities of this province, you got cars, you got trucks, you got motorcycles, you got bicycles, pedestrians, skateboarders, rollerbladers, e-scooters, and no doubt other things as well that I haven't thought of yet. And they're all trying to share the road safely, for the most part, sometimes not so safely. I'm sure we've all seen examples of them all doing things, people walking carelessly with their faces in their devices or cars running red lights. Anyway, we know the list. My question is it beyond our ingenuity to make all those disparate modes of transportation work together harmoniously on the same roads?
Absolutely not. We know how to do this. We are by no means the first place that has tried to wrestle with these problems. Cities all around the world have worked on how do we share and how do we take road safety. And we know the answers. And Steve, I think it's important to reflect on something you said in your introduction. You know, is it bike lanes? Is it making space for non-car modes that's dangerous? And it's absolutely false. There's been research done by everybody, including by myself, that shows that making bike lanes makes things safer. Making wider sidewalks makes things safer. The car and the people driving the cars are the ones most likely to mess up in a way that kills somebody. And that's a choice we make through our infrastructure. When we prioritize cars, we are saying we choose death because we want a couple minutes of convenience. We don't have to do that. There's lots of examples on how to do it other ways. And the choice to do it at the moment is willful ignorance.
Well, okay, I don't want to leave everybody with the impression that nothing's been happening on this because, Eleanor, as I mentioned a moment ago, you did found this Share the Road Cycling Coalition. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a couple, two or three things that the coalition, through its work, has been able to do over the years that you think actually has made things safer?
I'll start with an $125 million investment in cycling infrastructure. Shoshana is absolutely right. There's a false paradigm around the fact that cycling infrastructure makes streets less safe, Steve. In fact, 87% of Ontarians, according to Share the Road data, are cyclists and motorists at the same time. This is about finding ways to share the road. And as she also points out, other countries, other jurisdictions in Europe in particular, and in the United States, and in Canada, too. I mean, I mentioned Montreal a few minutes ago. They are prioritizing cycling and walking. I spoke to several mayors. I spent 10 days in Quebec in small towns. And their first statement to me was, we are prioritizing active transport because it's a way of the future. We need to achieve our climate goals. But in order for us to attract the next generation of worker and families and the kind of communities we want, we are going to prioritize these modes of travel because 40% fewer young people are driving these days, Steve. Fewer and fewer young people are getting their driver's license because it's not affordable. They are choosing to get around differently. And cities around the world will tell you that they are attracting jobs and investment as a consequence of making those decisions. Pittsburgh, a city that Jeff knows well, he's from Philadelphia, has done that very thing in attracting Google to that city. The mayor of Pittsburgh tells the story about sitting down with the CEO and promising a number of things in order to secure that investment. And the CEO said to him, this is what I need. I need a bicycle-friendly city. I need transit-related development, and I need transit options because my people are not driving as much anymore. So it is a safety imperative. It is a moral issue in terms of choosing to increase speeds rather than lowering them, and choosing to not prioritize these modes of travel. That is a clear decision to be made, and it's being made, and we need to change that conversation, and we still have work to do. But it also has important economic implications because the future of cities is in active transportation and in finding ways, and that's what our politicians need to do more often.
Well, this is probably one of, I don't know how many, let's just say lots of conversations we've had on this program about this subject. And I can recall one 3 years ago where we had, from the Toronto Police Service, Warren Wilson, on the program talking about, and I gave him an example of something that's happening 50 yards from where this studio sits, the corner of Yonge and Eglinton, and what you will see at that intersection on any given day. Let's refresh people's memory about that, then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would, the clip. You could stand 50 meters north of this studio right now at the corner of Yonge and Eglinton. You could put an officer there, they could stand there all day long, and they could make a fortune. They could make a fortune pulling over people who are making illegal turns, who are running the red light, and so on and so forth. Why don't you?
We've taken the approach now to be more strategic, and the research has shown that what saves lives is stopping aggressive drivers, impaired drivers, slowing people down. That's where we focus our enforcement now. So we don't see you won't see as much police officers on side streets doing things. That doesn't mean stop signs and wearing your seatbelt isn't important. It is, but our real focus is on those, we call it the big four offenses, and that's that. But
what are the big four?
It's aggressive driving, distracted driving, impaired driving, and it's speeding.
Okay, Jeff, could you react to that off the top here?
Yeah, I mean, it's disappointing, right? We are all in this together, and you would hope that collectively we would allocate resources to do this sort of enforcement. But Steve, I think we need to even back up a little bit more and to say that if we are in places where we regularly need enforcement, what that would suggest is that the design is wrong. It is allowing people to act in ways and promoting behavior that is unsafe. And so I think, enforcement and regulation, those are really important. But if we get the design wrong to start, we're in a lot of trouble. And I think that maybe this is what we're seeing, is that in so many places, what's happening outside of your studio is happening out in front of my campus, where there is cars traveling down University Avenue at 100 kilometers an hour, where the turning radii are such that you can make turns at very high speeds and put our students at danger and our staff and faculty. So it's correct. We can't have police at every dangerous intersection in Canada or in Toronto or North America. We have to start with the design, and then we can move and enforce as appropriate.
Shoshana, follow up on that if you would, because we do hear a lot about redesigning what we have to make things safer. Give me one sort of tangible example of what that means.
One of the important things we can do is called daylighting intersections. So you make it so that pedestrians are more visible and more obvious at intersections. You can stop cars from parking right up against the intersection so that when you go to walk, you don't have to come out from behind a car and you're more easy to see. You can raise intersections up. You can do bump outs with the sidewalk. All of these things are very cheap and very effective.
All right. What about something, Eleanor, maybe, I remember in the early 1990s, Bob Rae's government brought in photo radar, and then Mike Harris's government got rid of it. Now, photo radar, I think we all well remember, people didn't like it because it did work to keep people driving more slowly. Should we bring it back? What do you think?
Boy, that's a tough one, Steve. I'd have to look at the latest research that pertains to, I'm not avoiding the question, but I do like to be careful in my responses when it's not a subject matter that I know really, really well. But I will say this, to your point, and to the officer that spoke a few minutes ago, unfortunately, we can't have officers at every intersection, but we can tell people what is expected of them in terms of the norms of driving behavior. And then when they fail to meet those norms, we charge them, and then there's an adjudication of their behavior. So start with lowering speed limits and giving municipalities, and again, this is not a partisan issue, but I will say that we did it when we were in government. We gave municipalities the opportunity to lower speed limits within their city limits. There isn't an epidemic of traffic and congestion in European cities, largely because they've prioritized transit, and we are doing that here, and that's fantastic. They've also slowed down speeds, and they've made it really easy and safe and convenient to ride your bicycle or walk, and they have prioritized in every single decision that they make, whether it's legislation, road design, and encouragement, because, driving, this is a conversation for another day, but it's one of the most highly subsidized forms of transportation that we have. And so when you start prioritizing, you have a different outcome. When I met the mayor of Apeldoorn in Holland in 2007, and I spent 2 weeks there touring and looking at what they'd done to create the kind of bicycle culture they have, he said, Eleanor, I asked him at the end, I said, tell me how you achieve this level of mode share where at least 50% of the population is using their bicycle daily for every single trip that they make. How did you achieve that sort of nirvana-like level of cycling? And he said, it's easy. We just made it really easy and really safe and convenient and cheap and affordable to take your bicycle and to choose it every single time. And we made it more challenging, more difficult to take your car. That sounds like a crazy idea, but I think the time has come for us to start thinking about how we can balance our mode share more effectively. And that includes, to go back to the officer's comment, making it clear to drivers that they need to slow down. And so set those intercity speed limits slower, because the two colleagues here today, both of them excellent academics, will tell you about all the studies that exist that demonstrate that when you post lower speed limits and people are hit, they're less likely to suffer a fatal outcome or serious injury outcome when they're involved in a collision where the driver has been going a lot slower. That just makes sense to everyone. So let's look carefully at lowering our speed limits. Let's banish the myths that slowing people down enhances congestion. There are a lot of myths here that we need to address, because that simply isn't the case either. And, that alone, lowering speed limits, is a really good step. So I heard what the officer said. Law enforcement is only part of the equation. They will enforce, Steve, the laws that they are given. They can't go outside those parameters. And so beginning to really tell motorists and everyone else, because again, a lot of us do all three. We walk, we cycle, we drive. And so let's continue to escalate that mode share. It doesn't mean that we don't prioritize driving, but we need to do something about our roads to make them safer and to start looking at the equation that results in those better outcomes.
What is the evidence, though, Jeff? Tell us about when you put up signs reducing the speed limit, do people actually follow that limit?
Yeah, that's a tough one, Steve. I don't think that's the case. The evidence suggests that it's really the geometric features that dictate how people drive. So again, if I use University Ave here in Waterloo, right out in front of our campus, it is 2 lanes in each direction. There are wide shoulders. There is some downgrades. It really promotes traveling at speeds that are much higher than we would want in a pedestrian-friendly area. Elsewhere in Waterloo region, they did something called a road diet that our colleagues will know something about. There was 2 lanes in each direction on a kind of a local road. There was no reason for the 2 lanes. There was no capacity constraints. And so they took a lane in each direction away. They put in a planted median. They put in bike lanes. They narrowed that roadway. And it sent a very different message to drivers that this was a place in which you were going to share the road with cyclists and pedestrians, and you were going to travel at a speed that was appropriate for that sharing. I think I just want to go back to one thing that Eleanor has said a number of times, and that's the word prioritize. In North America, after World War II, we began to prioritize autos above everything else in every urban setting. And now what we're trying to do in many places, Steve, is we're trying to go back and retrofit cities so that we can accommodate pedestrians and cyclists, where what we really need to do is on every project that starts in an urban setting, we have to start and say, who are the vulnerable users? Our pedestrians, our cyclists, our rollerbladers, our scooter riders, all of the people that you mentioned in the intro here, Steve. And we have to put them first. Let's accommodate those folks first. And then let's think about how we can get the automobile fit in as sort of an afterthought, to be candid, and do it in a way that makes sure that the travel speeds and the travel behaviors of the drivers are going to be satisfactory for all the other users first. That's the priority that we should think about the way our designs happen in our urban settings.
Okay, Shoshana, I want to bring a chart up now, and I'd like to get your take on what these numbers seem to say. This was driving while distracted. And we have a chart here that shows the percentage of fatally injured drivers who were distracted while driving. And it's broken down by age demographic. And for those listening on podcast, let me just say the biggest demographic of those fatally injured drivers who were driving while distracted are those between the age of 16 and 19. No other demographic is as high. What do you infer from those numbers?
To be honest, not that much. I mean, the numbers are probably pretty close within the margin of error of the study and what we would call the uncertainty. 16 to 19-year-olds are our earliest drivers. They're in some ways more dangerous than other drivers because they have less experience and are more likely to make a mistake. But the thing about doing road design and community design well is that you make it so that mistakes aren't fatal. Everybody is going to make a mistake at some point, and we don't want to live in a world where a 17-year-old making a mistake means that for the rest of their life they have killed somebody, or that somebody else's life is ended because a teenager made a mistake. Of course, teenagers are going to make a mistake. Our responsibility as a society is to build a system where that mistake doesn't equal death. Gotcha.
We have a minute left here, and Eleanor, this is in some respects a terrible thing I'm going to ask you to do with only a minute to go here, but Ardith Brought buried her husband 2 months ago, and you've been there, and I wonder if you could give her some advice on how she's going to get through the rest of her life.
That is tough, Steve. I'm happy to tell her what I did. I'm blessed to have a tremendous support network of family and friends who just kept telling me one day at a time, get up every day, and that's one thing you can do. Just get up and get dressed and try to put one foot in front of the other, because your life partner and your best friend has just been taken from you in the worst of ways, especially in a preventable collision. You know, my husband was a police officer, and while I didn't worry about him getting killed on the job, it is always in the back of your mind as a spouse of a police officer, to have him taken doing something that he loved and something that made him, you know, the kind of fit sort of, you know, citizen who enjoyed good health, kept him out of the hospital, lowered our health care, did things that were good for the environment, is a little bit more egregious. And so to Mrs. Brought, I say, take a deep breath. There's a lot of love and support around you in the community, and just take it one day at a time. It does get easier over time. The loss never truly goes away, because that's just not the nature of life, but it does get easier over time.
Brilliant advice. Eleanor McMahon, thank you so much for joining us from Parry Sound tonight. Jeff Casello and Shoshana Sachs, grateful to have you alongside for this important conversation. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.